Mm. Okay. Hello out there in video land. We are continuing with Stanislaus's Joyce's book on his brother, My Brother's Keeper. And today we're going to begin with chapter 4. Let me just make a note, if you haven't listened to the earlier chapters, I think we can all recommend it. Some of it is really interesting, and it's a fairly easy reading. So I think we're all looking forward to another chapter. And this one is chapter 4, called Ripening. And I will begin the reading. Ripening. It has become a fashion with some of my brother's critics, among them his friend Italo Suevo, to represent him as a man pining for the ancient church he had abandoned, and at a loss for moral support without the religion in which he was bred. Nothing could be further from the truth. I am convinced that there was never any crisis of belief. The vigor of life within him drove him out of the church. That vigor of life that is packed into the 700-odd quarto pages of Ulysses. As a young man, he was rather like Lovborg in Ibsen's Hedda Gabler, but with a steely firmness of will that Lovborg lacks. My brother was undoubtedly interested more in the Catholic Church than in any other organized system in Europe. He found its theologians ruthlessly logical, granting their premises and suggestive of thought even when he didn't agree with them. And something of the pomp and ceremony with which the legend of Jesus is told impressed him profoundly. But on almost all points of first importance, his attitude toward Catholicism was more like that of the gargoyles outside the church than of the saints within it. Next reader, please.
A Jesuit review published in Dublin wrote that his intellect was a great Jesuit trained intellect that had gone over the powers of Satan. In other words, the Jesuits laid a kind of claim to him. The purpose of Jesuit training is to instill the belief that all our time and the use of our gifts belong to God, and further so to develop the conscience as to make cowards of us all. Their aim is to enslave the mind completely and make it work for their ends. In my brother's case, they failed signally. In all respects in which his personality was outstanding, he made himself. Certainly his conscience was abnormally developed, but not in the way they desired. If it urged him to hold his gifts in an unflinching fealty to something beyond his ambition for himself, it was in fealty to the truth of life as he saw it and understood it, and to the sincerity of his art in recreating it. Next, please.
He did indeed toy with theosophy as a kind of interim religion. His interest in it had been aroused by reading Yeats and Russell, and though he never belonged either to the Hermetic Society or to the Theosophical Society that existed in Dublin then, and for all I know, perhaps still exists, he read with serious intent expository works on theosophy by Madame Blavatsky, Colonel Olcott, Annie Besant, and Ledbetter, and I ploughed through them after him, gathering scorn. I have a faint recollection of a poem called Nirvana, which described a state not of bliss, but rather of what mystical writers call the station of spirit. On the whole, however, I think his serious interest in theosophy lapsed very quickly, and that he was amused by my disrespectful transformations of the names of the most illustrious theosophists. Colonel Old Cod, Madame Blavatsky, a name that suited her flabby, puckered face and puckered eyes that seemed to be peering through cigarette smoke. Annie B's aunt, and Mr. Wife-Beaten. Theosophy may have been the only intellectual adventure of his non-age that he regarded as pure waste of energy. Nevertheless, it brought him in contact with certain mystical writers whose personalities were less questionable. The anti-Jesuit Miguel de Molinos, St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa, St. Catherine of Siena, Thomas Kempis. A cursory dip into these writers was enough to convince me that I could not work up any interest in them. I skimmed through the books, paused to read here and there, and I found an oasis. Next, please.
Why are you pottering about with the misty mystics? I asked him. They interest me, he replied. In my opinion, they are writing about a very real spiritual experience you can't appreciate. There you are, right anyhow. And they write about it, he continued, with a subtlety that I don't find in many so-called psychological novels. It is clear, however, that at this time he felt very forcibly both the attraction of mysticism and the call of reality. And for a while he was interested in the figure of Paracelsus, scientist and mystic, who had labored somewhat too boldly in both spheres. But the willful thinking of the expositors of theosophy, a suspicion of deliberate self-deception in them, alienated his sympathies. The world they introduced him to was arid. Not only did the self-surrender and asceticism of mysticism, a bodily instead of an intellectual discipline, run contrary to his nature, but mysticism disappointed him also because it had allured him with the promise of intuitions of reality beyond reality. In such reality he could have believed. Life itself is a symbol, he said, quoting a reply of Ibsen's to one of his critics who had objected to the symbolism in his dramas. But mysticism, instead of enhancing the significance of life, required from the adept a total renunciation of it. Instead of imaginative intuitions, mysticism offered unsatisfying figments of the fancy. Next, please.
He knew at length that this path would lead him to no goal that he wished to attain. But how long he dallied with it, I cannot say. Temperamentally, he was not the kind of man to find his heart's ease amid a murmuration of mystics. At Trieste, however, he lectured on two writers, a mystic and a realist, Blake and Defoe. Brief as our residence in each of these numerous addresses was, it was still long enough in most cases to be marked by a death in our family. At Milbourne Lane, the boy Frederick died in the first weeks of his infancy. At Windsor Avenue, another male infant came, stillborn, into the world. And while downstairs, my father was, as usual, assuring the sober friend who had brought him home for the occasion, "My God, he's not dead yet." Upstairs, his last-born child was dead already. But at least these infants may be supposed not to have suffered. At Glengarriff Parade, the youngest surviving son, Georgie, so named because he was born on the 4th of July, died of peritonitis following typhoid fever in his 14th year, at the age when life, whatever it may be, is sweet to all. Next.
After Jim, he was the most promising member of the family, a handsome boy who had outgrown his strength a little, but otherwise was not weak. He'd always attracted attention as a child of 2 or 3 by his good looks and golden ringlets, though his hair was darker when he died. As a boy, his infectious laugh, almost too adult for his years, with a spice of malice in it. At school he did very well, skipping a class in the year he went to Belvedere, and at the same time beginning Latin without any apparent effort in the house where study was rendered as difficult as possible. If memory was as good as Jim's, his power of concentration was not yet developed, but at drafts, at any rate, he could generally get the better of me, if drafts is any test. He had a little voice, but had instead a fine ear for music, and was already beginning to strum on the piano. He accepted as unquestionably as I did the idea that someday Jim would make his name as a writer, and whenever he was present at our discussions, he would hang on their borders like a skipping wicket. Though still a boy, he was one of those people whose presence banishes boredom. Next.
When he fell ill, my mother was undecided whether to send him to the Mater Misericordiae Hospital, which was quite near, or to nurse him at home. He was her youngest, and after her estrangement from Jim, her favourite son, and she resolved to keep him at home. He was a patient who never complained. But when, during the crisis, the pains became acute, he would part his arms around his mother's neck and remain so until they abated. She nursed him through the long weeks of typhoid fever until the doctor announced that all danger was over. My mother asked what diet she should give the boy. Soup, meat, anything you like, he answered carelessly. Against her own judgment, she gave him some soup and a morsel of meat, but it was enough to prove fatal. After taking food for the first time for many weeks, he felt better. In his emaciated face, his dark blue eyes looked larger than ever, but there was no weariness in their glance. They were alive to all that was passing. I had been reading The Bottle Imp to him afternoons when I came home from school, but now he asked Jim to sing along for him the setting he had composed for Yeats's poem, "Who will go drive with Fergus now and pierce the deep wood's woven shade?" Katrina?
Jim went downstairs to the parlor and, leaving the doors open, sat down at the piano and sang the melancholy chant to which he had set the verses. Very shortly afterwards, the symptoms of perforation of the intestines appeared. I was sent running for the doctor and someone else for a priest. Georgie was still quite conscious and calm, only saying to his terrified mother, "I am very young to die." He died that evening. In the first outburst of grief, when my mother saw that he was dead in her arms, her thoughts raced back to the time when he was an infant. "When I took him out for a walk on the esplanade at Bray," she said, sobbing brokenly, "everybody used to turn and look after him. Why an operation was not attempted at the last moment, I cannot understand." Then the then rector of the college, Father Tompkin, wished him to have a public funeral from the college chapel, and 2 of his Jesuit teachers were sent to offer condolence on behalf of the rector and to make the proposal. At the sight of the dead boy, one of them could not control his tears. No doubt it is contrary to Jesuit discipline, but I record it gratefully and in his honor. The Jesuit wept. My father had kept fairly sober during his son's long illness. Sometimes, excuse me, sometimes even reading to him in the evenings. He was a good reader, especially of humorous stories such as Mickey's Free Father and the Ghost, but he did not feel his son's death very deeply. My mother never recovered from it. She could not forgive herself for having obeyed the doctor's instructions, especially since it had seemed to her sometimes that the big countrified blockhead had been drinking. Let's see, Duncan.
Yeah. When I went back to school after the funeral, I felt raw and restless. For a couple of years before he died, Georgie, 2.5 years my junior, had been a companion for me in ways that did not interest Jim. Long-armed and long-legged, he was a good swimmer, and we used to keep count of our baths to see which of us would make the higher score by the end of the summer. To hit some imaginary staidness in my character, he nicknamed me Brother John. Mother was certainly wrong in thinking Jim callous. He didn't display his feelings as others did, but he felt Georgie's death no less. When he thought everyone was asleep, he went softly upstairs to see the poor little fellow, where he lay alone with the blue of his eyes still visible under the lids that had closed too late. And not long afterwards, at the mention of Irish rebellion, he exclaimed bitterly, Ireland is an old sow that devours her Pharaoh. It is a reflection on Irish history that I saw in the expression his smoldering anger at Georgie's untimely death, and thought to myself, there goes what I was trying to say. Next reader, please.
He thought that by the boy in the following dream epiphany, Georgie was intended. There is no dancing. Go down before the people, young boy, and dance for them. He runs out, darkly clad, lithe and serious, to dance before the multitude. There is no music for him. He begins to dance far below in the amphitheater with a slow and supple movement of the limbs, passing from movement to movement in all the grace of youth and distance, until he seems to be a whirling body, a spider wheeling amid space, a star. I desire to shout to him words of praise, to shout arrogantly over the heads of the multitude. See, see, his dancing is not the dancing of harlots, the dance of the daughter of Herodias. It goes up from the midst of the people, sudden and young and male, and falls again to earth, tremulous, sobbing, to die upon its triumph. Next, please. What is that from?
I have no idea.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. He called his son, born at Trieste, Giorgio. In a letter of condolence to me, one of the Jesuits had asked me how my thoughts were running. Since the funeral, the course of my thoughts had been setting more favorably than usual towards them, but the letter was a sudden check. It angered me because I saw in it a pouncing readiness to take advantage of youth and grief in an open wound. I did not answer the letter. What could I have told him? The truth and leave the college? A lie or a conventional white lie? And feel a coward? I should have answered the letter without answering the question, but I was not sufficiently diplomatic to think that. Another younger brother, Charlie, little more than a year older than the boy that died, but he had a vocation for the priesthood and entered the seminary. He had paired off with Georgie as children do in large families, and being the less intelligent, had imitated and followed him around. In his dumb sorrow and loneliness, the idea of being a priest comforted him, besides appealing strongly to his vanity. When I told the English teacher, Dempsey, why Charlie was leaving the school, he laughed. So, he said, he is provided for in this world and the next. I wondered how much anti-critical animus might be lurking under the all-pervading sycophancy towards priests in Ireland. Wow. I was no longer greatly disturbed by religious doubts. My position seemed to me clear enough. The Jesuits, like all priests, dealt largely in infinitude, and the words infinite and eternal came easily to their lips. For my part, when I tried to imagine an infinite universe without boundaries anywhere, topless, bottomless, uncentered, my thoughts returned to earth, baffled and bewildered by the vain quest for something which was beyond the reaches of the soul. But it was also incredible that the universe somewhere should end, for where it ended, something else must, I reasoned, begin. Time with a beginning and time without a beginning were equally beyond the range of my imagination. To speak of infinite space or infinite time, or of their opposites, finite space and finite time, seemed to me to be a mystification, a playing with syllables void of meaning, mere counters that did not correspond to any comprehensible ideas, words that were the disingenuous hic sunt leones of dim, unchartable regions of thought. The effort to imagine the infinitely little, too, arrested the heart like a hand of ice. And yet, was it believable that the universe was finite at the small end and infinite at the big end? Next page.
Into this category of essentially incomprehensible ideas, I put the idea of God. The Jesuits used this word glibly too, and knew all the predictables relating to it. For me, it was a mystery beyond the range of thought, co-equal with the universe. I needed no convincing that I was able to think, if only the rudimentary thoughts that then occupied me, and that I had purposes, if only the purpose to try my ideas out on Jim. If thought and purpose existed in me, or broadly speaking, in mankind, they existed in the universe in which I existed. I was driven to the dilemma of asserting either that the thought and purpose existed only in me or also outside me, less than a microbe in a planetary system, itself less than a microbe in the universe. I felt the absurdity of affirming that I, or man, was the only thinking and purposing being in it. Beyond that tentative cogito ergo deus est, I could not see. But so far, the argument was stringent enough for me. The rest was too vast for anything but cold speculation. I was altogether ignorant of philosophical systems at the time, but nothing that I have since read or heard ever changed that early attitude of benevolent agnosticism. Next, please.
You need to turn on your microphone, dear Lois.
Sorry about that. Jim listened patiently enough to my exposition of these ideas, but when I had finished, he said in broad vernacular, "Is that the kind of thoughts you do be thinking when you're going the road around Dublin a fair city? What's funny about my ideas? I didn't say they were funny," he answered more seriously, "but you have a curious way of considering the whole question, as if you didn't care a rap one way or another." He missed the sense of supreme responsibility, which is the sense of sin. I had never been God intoxicated. As a matter of fact, I don't care very much. Hasn't it occurred to you that you are not properly equipped for such a discussion? Strange to say, it has. But it has also occurred to me that if this discussion is only for properly equipped people, it cannot concern me. At the same time, I don't feel in any way bound to accept the learned opinion of such people. However, you accept the opinions of popular astronomers. Oh, in a very different spirit, or rather, in a very indifferent spirit. God interests me only a little more than astronomy. I'm a home ruler in the universe, too. Jim looked at me askance and said comically, "There's a queer, grim Dutch touch about your phiz. I pity the poor woman who wakes up to find it on the pillow beside her." Next.
Jim was arguing against himself. His own attitude was more or less the same. I am convinced, but my exposition of it had made it seem flat and distasteful to him. Moreover, he had little interest in the scientific or pseudo-scientific aspects of rebellion. He flouted the idea that science could supersede philosophy and consider science to be rather another kind of false religion, more inhuman and barren than the one he had left, and God had been once a living reality for him. I was not grim, however. I was happier than I'd ever been as an observant Catholic, with doubts forever popping up in my mind. And at school now I felt detached and untroubled. One of our teachers, perhaps noticing some change in me, told us in an impromptu homily, unconnected with our working class, that we went out into the world, we should meet people who would be only too willing to undermine our faith. We were always to bear in mind, he said, that if a man is ill, he goes to a doctor who has studied medicine. If he has a case in law, he goes to a lawyer who has studied law. If a man has religious doubts, he should go to a priest of his church who has studied theology. I had ceased to be disputatious or eager to rebut the arguments of a preacher, but just for that reason, perhaps, the obvious objections occurred to me spontaneously before he had ceased speaking. that we go to what doctor or lawyer we choose, and for advice, and not for orders. Joe?
Still another flitting, not the last, but the last that Jim took part in, deposited us at 7 St. Peter's Terrace, Cabra, which in Irish means something like barren or blighted land. Today, it is a good middle-class residential quarter. My father, moved perhaps after Georgie's death by some transient twinges of conscience, commuted part of his small pension and bought the little two-storied house in Cabra and some indispensable furniture at auctions. We were now reduced in numbers, for Charlie, as I said, had entered a seminary, and on Sundays his admiring sisters had the pleasure of seeing him, complete with soutane, berretta, and prayer book, filing down from Clonliffe College with the other clerical students to High Mass at the Pro Cathedral in Marlborough Street. My father moved into the new house with the usual programme of good intentions, but if he himself had any illusion that they would last beyond a fortnight, he was the only member of the family that had. Katrina.
Jim's Ibsen night and paper on the drama and life caused some stir in the upper spheres of the university, for his English professor, Father Darlington, of whom there is a not unsympathetic thumbnail sketch as Dean of Studies in A Portrait of the Artist, thought fit to lecture on Sophocles, Shakespeare, and Ibsen, borrowing the books for his study of the third person of the Trinity from my brother. I was present at the lecture, but remember only that his criticism of Ibsen was not hostile. When we were coming out of the hall, one of the group of the Irish language enthusiasts, seeing me standing near him, said loudly in harsh northern accent that suited his way, complexion, and blunt features so well, "I don't see how any man could know more about Ibsen than Father Darlington does." When I told Jim, he laughed. "Poor fellow," he said. "Evidently he has had to swallow something that doesn't agree with him." "That Magerfeld boor," I said angrily, "is consumed with envy of you." "It looks like it," Jim said carelessly, "but I am sorry for him if he can't think of any better way to vent his spleen. Any girl of 15 or 16 could have told him how to do it sweetly." In conversation with Jim, Father Darlington, another English convert, had said that he thought A Doll's House an excellent argument against mixed marriages. Jim wondered how he had worked that out. Having seen in some review an announcement that William Archer was preparing a book on the poets for the younger generation, Jim had written to him before we left Glengarriff Parade to propose certain young Irish poets whose work he liked. If my memory does not betray me, he also sent him a thin green volume of verses by an Irish poet, Paul Gregan, who was personally unknown to my brother. So far as I know, Jim never met him. At the same time, my brother sent Archer his own unpublished poems and received in answer a painstaking criticism, which was not without some retarded effect. Duncan.
Okay, let us stop.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of meat in this, what we've read. So I'm going to go back to the beginning of the chapter and begin looking. It's really interesting.
Well, it's interesting. I see that Joyce composed. He composed the setting for Yeats' poem, so he wrote music as well as performed it.
Okay, what page is that on, Katrina?
That's page 134.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, he asked Jim to sing for him the setting he had composed.
Mm-hmm. You don't see too many references to his composing.
I was just thinking the same thing. It's the first and last time I ever heard of it.
So, yeah, and he did that for Giorgio, as Giorgio is about to die.
Yeah. And he seems to have composed the setting for piano,
Yes,
which we know he played.
yes.
And see, that's a question that comes up in Sirens. You know, if you're remember we had a long talk about Sirens there a couple of weeks ago about the composition of music in it. And one of the questions is what was his level of competence at composing? And the answer seems to be not great, but it definitely existed.
Yeah.
You know, that's the important point, that it definitely, and there's proof, because he sat down. He didn't just compose a setting in the background and la 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 it along. He sat down at the piano and sang with the piano. We see it.
Going back a few pages before this, I found the discussion about James Joyce and the Theosophical Society pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and all the big names are there: Blavatsky, Olcott, Besant, and Ledbetter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love the reference to Madame Blavatsky.
Yeah.
Blavatsky, yeah.
She wasn't pretty.
No.
Yeah. And it ties in with that story of Gauguin himself breaking into the Theosophical Society. I think that was the name, in their branch in Dawson Street. You know, and leaving a note. I think sorry, I'm boring you with this second time. They left did a certain amount of scattering of stuff or whatever they were looking for. They may have effected entry. Seemed to may perhaps had a key, but may have broken in, and left behind a slightly ransacked room and an item of female underwear with a note written on it. It was "I what done it, William McGee." So I always feel that particular escapade must have been alcohol inspired. The two lads.
I suspect that was one of many for those fellows.
Yeah, but
Parts of town.
But it's actually the Hermetic Society, I think, but they were the branch of the Theosophical Society of New York in Dublin. But their skepticism of the whole Theosophical Society behavior that comes out here seems to feed into that little story, which is true.
Yeah, it's amazing how rich these pages are. You know, because we have the Theosophical Society, and then he goes on to mention that that James Joyce, went into the Christian mystics and mentions, you know, some of the big ones: Saint John of the Cross, Saint Teresa, Catherine of Siena, Thomas à Kempis.
Yeah, Thomas à Kempis. Yeah.
You mentioned the Hermetic Society, Joe. There were the Hermetic Society of the Golden Dawn.
Right. I beg your pardon. I apologize for my error.
It's all right. It just isn't like your shorthand.
Yeah, the Golden Dawn.
Right.
That was the one Yeats was involved with, I think, wasn't it?
Oh, sure, the whole kit and caboodle were there, yeah.
And I know you've heard that famous story about Yeats throwing Crowley down the stairs.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is quite a story.
And that's it. You get all these parodies of the Hermetic Society of the Golden Dawn. You know, with Paddy Digname's spirit coming back to talk about them. You know, the bush you're looking for is to be behind the return, and all this. You know, the appearances from the other spirit world, and all the like. As parodies. So here's the factual background to it.
Clearly, Jim got done with it fairly quickly.
Yeah. And Georgie died of peritonitis. Didn't Joyce himself die of that?
Duodenum, I think, perforation of the duodenum.
Is that the same thing as peritonitis?
I think it pretty much is, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, it's a little higher up, but I believe peritonitis is pretty much in the small intestines, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, well,
It's where the small, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not an expert in these matters, but I believe peritonitis is where the wall of the intestine breaks and leaks into the cavity. It's kind of like sepsis.
yeah. So it's different.
But the duodenum, it's coming, it's a, I think it comes out of the stomach. It's like the valve between the stomach and the small intestine.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But I appreciated Stanislaus talking about the deaths in the family. I don't think that us modern folks quite appreciate the closeness of death
Yeah.
happening in every family at that time.
Yeah. And death took place in your home.
Yes.
Like you don't sort of suddenly a relation disappears and you hear they're dead in the hospital and go visit. They're upstairs dead.
Yep.
And yeah.
Yeah, that makes a very different psychological world when the average citizen encounters death on that level. They say that this is a little bit of an aside. Well, it's not a little bit, it is an aside, that the big trauma of the Civil War in the United States was that the fighting took place far enough away that the families could not prepare their dead.
Right.
And that caused a great deal of guilt and anguish.
Yeah.
Because the standard thing was someone would die, you bring him in and do the kitchen table clean up and all that. And that was a way of reconciling.
Coping mechanism. Yeah.
Part of the
You had things to do. During the Civil
agreed.
War, you just knew that, whoever Johnny went off to be a soldier and you get a notice that they're dead.
Yeah.
But you never see the body. There's no ritual to deal with. And, there are those who insist that that trauma is still reverberating.
Yeah.
Within the states.
And there would be people who would not believe the notice because administrative errors occur.
Yeah.
And, names can be duplicated and lists can be wrong. And yeah. And then you clutch straws, in the hope. Yeah.
This is what's happening in modern warfare, say the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where a lot of the Russian soldiers seem to have been just left by the side of the road and were not repatriated.
Yeah, don't bring the bodies back. Yeah.
So to bring it back to Ireland and Dublin and the Joyce family, I think that's a really interesting little section there. And it's really interesting that actually Stanislaus implies that that the mother was giving bad dietary advice, and that's what caused the death.
Oh yeah. He's saying it, and he sometimes had drink taken,
Yeah.
It's yeah. And her, I must say, I can feel for his mother. When I took him out for a walk on the Esplanade at Bray, she's remembering the lovely house down in Bray and where they are now, So, sobbing brokenly.
And this is kind of a little bit of a emotional breakthrough for Stanislaus himself. The way he's writing this is, he tends to present himself as a pretty steely character.
Yeah.
But in this particular passage, it seems like he's softened up a bit here.
Yes. It must have been very hard to write, even after all those years.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And there's a lot of mixed with the pathos. There's a lot of bitterness mixed in here as well. He's still, at least when he's writing here, he hasn't forgiven his father.
Kept fairly sober.
Mm-hmm.
Damning with faint praise.
And how about the sentence about the Jesuit father? No doubt it is contrary to Jesuit discipline, but I recorded gratefully, and in his honor, the Jesuit wept.
Yeah.
That's actually quite good.
Yeah.
Is that a variation on Jesus wept?
Yeah, at the death of Lazarus, and it's just that sentence in the Gospels, and Jesus wept. Yeah, and the Jesuit wept. The Jesuit. Yeah, yeah.
And I hadn't known that Joyce named his son after the dead brother.
George, yeah. Georgiel.
I always thought it was an odd name for somebody to choose for his son at that time, but I thought it was the Italian influence of the Giorgio. I hadn't realized it was the Italian version of his dead brother's name.
Yeah. George, right.
Go ahead, Joe.
No, I was just going to ask the question that George was born. How long after this? It's about 3 years only, isn't it? I don't know where we are in years now. George was born in 1906, I think. Anyone know? Well, it might come clear as we go.
So do we know where this little writing here, that is no dancing, go down before the people, young boy? And
I tried Googling it and I got nowhere.
Tom Kennedy? No?
Say again?
They're on page 136.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see if I can get it. Let's see. He thought that by the boy in the following dream epiphany, Giorgio was intended.
Yeah.
Then there's a quote, that is no dancing.
Yeah. I got the impression that they kept notebooks and they called them the epiphanies. Either one or both of them. Perhaps they just kept one notebook. And they used to record epiphany, and this is one that doesn't find its way. There is an epiphany from memory in Stephen Hero of this event, but it's not that. So I'd love to know where those notebooks are. That you could see, but it doesn't seem to have been. I don't know. It doesn't register with me as appearing in any. But there is one about this episode. There's an epiphany used in Stephen Hero. I'm pretty sure of that. So
No.
There is, where did I find it? In the index of the book, under Epiphanies, it says, see Joyce, James writings. So I'm looking. Writings are, see if it says anything. Oh. If, at a glance here, I don't think it.
Okay, so the next page
Yeah.
in the Viking on 263 at the bottom, it has writings, articles, criticisms, essays, et cetera, et cetera.
There's epiphanies, and it gives a lot of, but I think they're just mentioned. They don't say.
Mhm.
Yeah. In Elman,
Mm,
under Epiphanies, headings are J begins to write, day of rabblement. J records brother's death in page 94 and a note. And then you go to page 94, then there occurred the horrible scene described in one of Joyce's epiphanies and later inserted in Stephen Hero. Mrs. Joyce, crimson, trembling, appearing at the parlor door. Jim, Joyce at the piano. Yes. Mrs. Joyce, do you know anything about the body? What ought I do? There's something coming away from the hole in Georgie's stomach. Do you ever hear that happening? Joyce, surprised. I remember this when reading it. What I sent for the doctor, what do you think? I don't know. And James ran to the sick room and tried helplessly to revive his brother. George died of pneumonitis on the 9th of March 1902 as James himself was to die. That's now we know the slightly inaccurate. The bond between the two is suggested in another epiphany. They are all asleep. I woke up to him now. He lies on my bed. That's not there. Sure, it's not. Nose is dancing. And it goes on, poor little fellow. And it doesn't. So there seems to be more than one epiphany recorded for this terrible event.
Mhm.
I'd love to know what university those notebooks are in, and can you get access to them?
Mhm. Mhm.
Online. Just
That's quite dramatic, though. I mean, to have that happen within the household,
Yeah.
and for the implication was that somebody thought the doctor's advice was wrong, and that the mother was the one who fed Giorgio, and that's really hard to deal with.
Was that so rare though in those days? I think that I was always under the impression that one of the reasons that families had so many children was that they lost so many children.
Yes.
I know both my grandparents lost children.
Mm-hmm.
And Dublin had the worst record for infant births in Europe. You had to find similar figures. You had to go to places like India.
Oh wow! Okay.
The poverty was dreadful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, and by the way, it's 1902, so it's 4 years before his son. 4 years later, he christens his son George. Yeah.
Okay. Well, of course, at that particular time, I mean, once there's an infection set in, that's pretty much it. There's nothing that can be done because there was no penicillin until
antibiotic. Yeah.
We approached the Second World War, which is quite late.
Yeah.
Very.
Yeah. 1948, my uncle Joe, as a 20-year-old, died at home of pneumonia.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother had a memory like this. And then and a year later, she called her son Joe. You can
pneumonia was a dreaded disease.
Oh yeah. And my father went down to. He died at home. He was a single man, young man, and they were in a 3-story building, and my father washed the stairs himself manually. He got disinfectant and, trying to prevent the infection spreading to anyone else in the building. So it's kind
Going
of,
back to the notebooks, Joe, you were asking where they were.
yeah.
And I've just found a note here that says Joyce later published Recollections of James Joyce, 1950, published after his death on June 16th, were My Brother's Keeper, 1957, Dublin Diary, 1962, and Complete Dublin Diary, 1971.
Really? And
That's what I have here.
these are writings of James Joyce, the Dublin Diaries?
No, these are writings of Stanislaus, as I understand it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
No, Joe had just mentioned about where are these notebooks. So
Yeah. Yeah.
these must be retained somewhere.
I wonder if James Joyce's notebooks will be in those.
I wonder.
You know, like they seem to they seem to be a group effort, you know, a combined effort rather than them separately, because they dipped in and out of them. There may not be two
Stanislaus,
sets.
sorry, Joe. Stanislaus had also assisted Richard Ellman with Ellman's monumental James Joyce 1959. He also wrote an introduction for the translated version of Italos Vivezos, As a Man Grows Older.
Okay.
Well, let me try this.
While you're doing that, he said of his brother, Stanislaus wrote, "It seems to me little short of a miracle that anyone should have striven to cultivate poetry or cared to
Got
get
it.
in touch."
I got it.
Okay.
When I go down to renew my library card at the University of Texas, I can pick up a copy of the complete Dublin Diary of Stanislaus Joyce.
1971. Very good. Very good. Well done. Duncan, I don't know. What were you just going to finish that sentence?
Yeah, it says, of his brother, Stanislaus wrote, "It seems to me little short of a miracle that anyone should have striven to cultivate poetry or cared to get in touch with the current of European thought by living in a household such as ours, typical as it was of the squalor of a drunken generation. Some inner purpose transfigured him."
Some inner purpose transfigured him.
A great line, yeah.
Mm. And does anyone think he pined after the Catholic religion? Where he says, you know, mentioning Italis Huevo took us back to the opening sentence. Become fashion within some of my brother's critics, among them his friend Italis Huevo, represented him as a man pining for the ancient church he had abandoned.
What is this?
It's
I think he was more cynical than James was.
yes. Oh, definitely.
Somebody has got gorgeous bird song in the background, wherever it's coming from.
I've got some, but they're very faint. I don't think you can hear them.
Well, it's coming across loud and clear from somewhere.
Yeah. They're peeping.
Yeah.
I've definitely got it as well, but I don't think it's going to cross that.
No, that kind of whoosh.
I don't think my microphone is that good. Hey.
Yeah, I don't think it's a microphone. I mean, it's some other sound. To move on a little bit, what do you think about this dialogue between James and Stanislaus about what's funny about my ideas?
Where is that, Duncan?
That is on page 138.
Oh, that's right where I am.
Where it's right in this section where Stanislaus is really saying some interesting stuff about himself. And making all these, there's so much here. It's very, so if you see it, okay, so Jim listened patiently enough to my exposition of these ideas, but when I finished, he said in broad vernacular, "It's like the kind of thoughts you do be thinking when you're going around the road around Dublin's fair city. And what's funny about my ideas? I didn't say they were funny," he answered more seriously, "but you have a curious way of considering the whole question as if you didn't care a rap one way or the other. As a matter of fact, I don't care very much." And then James says, "Hasn't it occurred to you that you are not properly equipped for such a discussion?"
I love that.
And then Stanislaus says, "Strange to say, it has. But it's also occurred to me that if this discussion is only for properly equipped people, it cannot concern me. At the same time, I don't feel in any way bound to accept the learned opinions of such people." Anyway, I think it's a fun and odd little dialogue. Okay. So so we are actually almost back to where we stopped, and does anybody want to say anything about the remaining pages we've already read, or shall I go on and begin?
I have a question.
Yes.
On page 141, in their
Yes.
conversation about Father Darlington, that Maghera felt bore. What's a Maghera felt bore?
Maherafelt is a place in Northern Ireland.
Thank you.
They had a notorious prison there during what they call the Troubles.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, as long as we're at that spot, can somebody tell me what's a mixed? Oh, a mixed marriage must mean Protestant
And Catholic.
and Catholic.
Or Catholic and anything but not Catholic.
Yeah. As presented by the citizen, you know, between a half and half.
All righty. Shall I go ahead and begin William Archer's letter? Second letter to James Joyce, I should mention. Okay. Dear Mr. Joyce, I confess myself a great deal puzzled what to say about your verses. And it is that uncertainty which has kept me silent so long. I think, if you'll forgive me my saying so, that there is as yet more temperament than anything else in your work. You feel and you imagine poetically. But I do not find that as yet you have very much to say. Perhaps this is a mere narrowness of taste on my part. But I confess to a preference for poetry embodying a definite thought or a distinct picture rather than poetry which suggests only a mood. You will say that this criticism would equally apply to most of Verlaine and a great deal of Shelley. Well, perhaps it would. But you have got to write as exquisitely as they before you can validly plead their precedent. Joan.
The pieces I like best are One Hope, The Final Place, commonplace, the passionate poet, and tenebrae. In all these I see a very real promise. But do pray, let me beg you not to cultivate metrical eccentricities such as abound specially in the opening poem of the collection. In the first place, for instance, I have marked 4 lines that seem to me mere stumbling blocks and rocks of offense. I have also marked a line in tenebrae, which I almost think you must have miscopied. Didn't you mean to write, unto our call? Also, such rhymes as clothes and those will scarcely pass muster in serious verse. And to my thinking, you are much too fond of identical rhymes. I mean ending 2 lines with absolutely the same word. A trick to be very sparingly employed in English verse, but enough of these pedantries. Next, please.
My book of poets. Sorry. My book of poets, as you will see from the enclosed announcement, is long ago finished and will be out very soon. I have heard of Mr. Gregan's work, but indeed my list of poets was completed, and the book to all intents and purposes finished 2 years ago. Yours very truly, William Archer. The tone of the letter is friendly and serious. The writer is evidently trying to give the young poet the best advice he can and the benefit of his large experience. But he did not consider that at 17 or 18, neither Shelley nor Verlaine had written exquisitely. A poem of Shelley's, written apparently when he was 20, on Robert Emmet's grave, would deserve to pass unnoticed in an Irish country paper. What was true, and what I was beginning to notice, was that not all Jim's personality, or even the most distinctive part of it, found expression in verse, but only the emotive side, which in one respect was fictitious. It is not so with true poets. Next.
I was just going to say I didn't know that Robert Emmet had a grave. Jim wrote back defending some of his metrical devices, and Archer replied, still patient and controversial. He advised my brother against trying to have his poems published, as someday he might regret it, if his talent developed freely and normally. But, he added with Scotch balance, it's not always wise to refrain from action in the present, because we think we may regret it in the future. The collection of poems which Jim had sent Archer was not, of course, chamber music, but either moods or shine and dark. Juvenile poems of which, among those mentioned by Archer, only Commonplace, the second poem in chamber music, survives. Next, please.
We had already moved into the new house when my brother wrote The Day of Ravelment. This short article, written rapidly in one morning, accused the Irish Literary Theatre, which had declared war on the commercialism of the English stage, of prostituting the highest form of art, the drama, to the ravelment of the most belated race in Europe, which he called after Giordano Bruno, la bestia triomphante. He insisted that as Ireland had no dramatic tradition of its own, Irish dramatists should look abroad for their models, and pointed out that 8 years before, Shaw took advantage of the fact that the English censorship was powerless in Ireland. Next.
My contribution to the article, which he read to me in the afternoon of the Sunday on which he wrote it, consisted of 2 phrases, titter coyly instead of smile archly, because I objected, in the darkened theatre you cannot see how people smile, and Moore is beginning to draw upon his literary account. The article was written for St. Stephen's magazine and rejected by a member of the staff, author Chanel Cleary, who alleged unalterable censorship. Without wasting time on Cleary, my brother went hotfoot to the fountainhead, the rector of the university. He was chasing his shadow. The rector, nominally responsible, was amicable, but seemed to know little about the matter. He had not read the article. The incident was true in miniature to the pattern of clerical control everywhere. The nominal head is bland and sympathetic, while his subordinates have a free hand for their silent work of suppression. Whoever was the censor clearly speaks vaguely of a Father Brown, still another converted Protestant, rumoured to have a wife and daughter somewhere in England, who had no little say in the conduct of the magazine. Whoever it was, he mistook his man and missed his mark badly. At my brother's suggestion, Skeffington, who had had an article of his own on a forgotten aspect of the university question, rejected by the same censor, joined him in publishing both articles together at their own expense in the form of a pink-covered brochure of a few pages. Skeffington was then registrar of the college, a position which he subsequently resigned because of the rejection of his article advocating the admission of women to all faculties of the university. Joe?
He had been educated by his father on some system, so at least Jim told me, and was endowed with an enthusiasm that responded mechanically to all the more obvious appeals to justice, reason, and humanity. He had not yet considered the religious question, but he intended to devote a year to its consideration, he said, as soon as his work and studies left him time to do so. He was very methodical. Jim commented ironically that Skeffington was going to give a serious consideration to the problem whether laymen were permitted to think. Yet to me, Jim spoke of him as the most intelligent man in St. Stephen's College after myself. In the end, Jim's article, which begins with the challenging quotation from Giroldo Bruno, "No man," said the Nolan, "can be a lover of the true or the good unless he abhors the multitude," got more publicity than if it had not been censored, more than the longer and better article on Mangan, for he and I distributed to the newspapers and people in Dublin who my brother wished to see it. A mention of it appeared in the United Irishman, and I remember handing it in at Ely Place to George Moore's pretty servant. My brother's strictures on the cultured and uncultured rabblement, and on the Irish artists who he maintained had surrendered to the basest influences in national life, your popular devil, provoked in the following number of St. Stephen's magazine a comment apparently addressed to the students of the college, but fitter for the urchins of a national school. It declared that the Irish rabblement was willing in the interest of the traditional morality of the Catholic Church, outraged by the Countess Kathleen, to forego all that art might add to the surroundings of life. Katrina.
Not long after the publication of the brochure, Father Deneen, the professor of Irish and author of an Irish-English dictionary, went on an excursion with a group of students in the hills around Dublin. He was a little man with a pale, prematurely old face, like a pathetic leprechaun. But on this occasion, to show the lightness and innocence of his heart, he kept jumping up on the low stone walls along the way and off again. And every time he landed on the grassy border, he exclaimed amid the merriment of the students, "Said the Nolan." Jim had kept the reference to the Nolan advisedly, overriding objections from me, his doubting Thomas. He intended that the readers of his article should have at first a false impression that he was quoting some little-known Irish writer, the definite article before some old family names being a courtesy title in Ireland, so that when they discovered their error, the name of Giordano Bruno might perhaps awaken some interest in his life and work. Laymen, he repeated, should be encouraged to think. As far as arousing curiosity goes, he gauged his effect accurately enough but the rest is a matter of surmise. They certainly failed to notice that in the last sentence he proclaimed himself the successor of Ibsen. It was a proud boast of a youth of 19, but not an empty one, though not literally maintained. Duncan.
Who the Nolan was may have been revealed by my brother's Italian professor, Gysi, with whom, after the publication of the brochure, Jim had discussed Bruno's philosophy. Gysi, thinking perhaps that the discussion had been too objective, said, "But you must not forget he was a terrible heretic." "Yes," said Jim, "I'll remember. And also that he was terribly burnt." Jim, Jim was, in spite of that, on good terms with this young Italian Jesuit, who, coming from the Kolterstraat in the producer country of Catholicism, was not in full sympathy with the ignorant obedience mixed with Puritanism, which is the Irish blend. They had read and criticized in lively disputes the Annuncio's Il Fuoco, which my brother considered the highest achievement of the novel to date. The distinctive features of the new conscience, which was already urging my brother's adventurous prow into troubled water, were his inflexible sincerity as an artist and his firm belief that the artists are the true spiritual shepherds of the flock. Yet, though he seemed weird to classmates who reacted only to herd instincts, as a university student he maintained lively and by no means disinclined to gaiety. His abhorrence of the multitude was not uncompromising on all points. It did not, for example, prevent him from taking a rather prominent part in some ragging on the conferring of degrees. His loud laugh was characteristic and occasionally disconcerting, it appears, for once when he was laughing loudly in a group of students outside the gate of the National Library. A waspish old lady who had just emerged from the office of some Bible society or other in the same street came over to the group and asked angrily, "What's the matter with you, young man? Why is he laughing in such a way? He must be ill. You should take care of him and take him home." Next.
She confirmed, probably without knowing it, Leopardi's observation regarding the apprehension which the laughter of others can arouse in us. But the old dame knew her Bible, in which the only laugh that resounds is sardonic. My brother's laugh was not sardonic then. It was frank hilarity that gave no wry twist to the lips. A striving after elegance of phrase sometimes gives sententious airs to the essays of his student days, but it does not impugn the sincerity of his indignation that the cultured rabblement should prefer a lying clamor. That's from chamber music.
Mm-hmm.
Chiefly patriotic art to the splendor of truth. That's from Ibsen. Oh, wait a second. No, that's from Plato. Where am I? One consequence of his scorn and falsity and secrecy, collective and individual, written or acted, his determination to maintain the closest relation between his life and his work, while yet remaining free to create artistically, unhampered by the shackles of autobiography. A brief passage with Skeffington threw a curious sidelight on his changing attitude toward lyric poetry. At about the time of the publication of The Day of Rabblement, Jim and I were crossing Stephen's Green with Skeffington one afternoon, discussing a day's excursion to the Three Rock Mountains, which Skeffington was planning to make with the Sheeheys and some other students. Jim was invited to join them. Apropos of nothing, Skeffington, who liked to pose abruptly what he considered rock-bottom questions, asked him, "Have you ever been in love?" Next, please.
Habitually, when Jim was talking in earnest, he spoke slowly, not hesitatingly, but choosing his words with care, unless it was a matter he had thought out beforehand, in which case he spoke almost as he wrote. Now he rattled off an answer rapidly. How would I write the most perfect love songs of our time if I were in love, he asked. A poet must always write about a past or a future emotion, never about a present one. If it is a regular write down, honest to God, till death do us two part affair, it will get out of hand and spoil his verse. Poetry must have a safety valve, properly adjusted. A poet's job is to write tragedies, not to be an actor in one. He spoke volubly, and what he said, though unoriginal, was not altogether nonsensical, but the tirade was quite evidently a turn put on for Skeffington. When there was a pause, I interposed acidly. In any case, if you fail as a poet, you can go on the stage as a patter comedian. Skeffington laughed, but Jim, unabashed, went on in the same vein. When we parted from Skeffington at the door of the university, I asked Jim, do you really think your poems are so perfect? Evidently, I think highly of them, otherwise I shouldn't be trying to find a publisher for them. I think that nature abhors perfection and that most readers agree with her. Is that a quotation from that brilliant diary of yours? No, but it will be. A coruscation? He used to say that I reminded him of a sluggish saurian whose scaly hide occasionally reflected glints of light. Next.
I've lost my spot.
It occurred to me when I was reading.
It occurred to me when I was reading Pope's essay on man. Pope's what? Why on earth are you reading that? Culture, said I briefly and grimly. You take my mistakes hostage, said Jim, dismissing the point that did not interest him and reverting to the one that did. Do you expect me to return an intelligent answer when Skeffington asks a damn silly question? Well, I suppose not, I agreed. They made the excursion to the Dublin Hills, and one of the results for my brother was a suggestion for two of the songs afterwards, included in chamber music. What counsel has the hooded moon, and lightly come and lightly go? Next, please. Lois.
The prettiest of the Sheehy girls furnished the inspiration for both. Not that Jim was ever in love with her, though in a portrait of the artist Lynch calls her beloved. They never met, as far as I ever knew, except at the Sunday evening parties in our father's house, or at some very rare occasions, such as this excursion. And their relations were, on one side at least, always rather diffident and conventional. His daughter really took part in the charades they played so often, preferring to be an onlooker. But the weather and the mood of the little group conspired to make the excursion entirely successful, and the girl was young, happy, and very handsome. Next.
When they were returning late in the evening, all a little tired, there was some talk about the pale rose-coloured moon that had risen with a halo, a sign that rain was near, some weather prophet predicted. The pretty Sheehy girl who was walking with my brother thought it looked tearful. It looks to me like the chubby hooded face of some jolly fat capuchin, said Jim. The girl, in too happy a mood to be shocked, gave him a sidelong glance out of her large dark eyes and said, basing her conclusion, one may suppose, not exclusively on that observation of his, I think you are very wicked. Not very, said Jim, but I do my best. After they had separated and she had gone off home with the brother and sister who had also been of the party, Jim strolled on in no hurry because he had the idea of a song in his head. Having no other writing materials, he tore open a cigarette box and, standing under a street lamp, wrote the two verses of the song on the inside of the box in his firm, neat handwriting. Joe?
What counsel has the hooded moon put in thy heart, my shyly sweet? O love in ancient plenilune, glory and stars beneath his feet, a sage that is both kith and kin with thy comedian Capuchin. Believe me rather that am wise in disregard of the divine. A glory kindles in those eyes, trembles to starlight mine, O mine. No more be tears in moon or mist for thee, sweet sentimentalist.
It's amazing to just write that.
In the fifth and last chapter of A Portrait of the Artist, in which my brother shows the artist, the young poet, in the throes of creation, he uses the cigarette box incident for the villanelle of the Temptress, which was written a few years before the supposed date of the chapter, his first departure from Dublin, and belonged to one or other of the earlier collections. He also blends the figure of Mary Sheehy in the novel with an imaginary girl child for whom Daedalus is supposed to have a fleeting affection as a boy. I tell the incident faithfully as Jim told it to me. The song was written on the inside of the cigarette box. The song written on the inside of the cigarette box was "What counsel has the hooded moon?" And I kept that curious manuscript for years. But when I came back to Trieste after the First World War, I could not find it again. The key word in the song is sentimentalist. My brother was beginning to realize that he was not made of the proper stuff to be a lover because he was not a sentimentalist. Mary Sheehy was the only girl who ever aroused any emotional interest in him, but compared with the wild, radiant, enduring passion of which he soon after showed himself to be capable, it could not be called love. As for his love poems, the fact is that when he did fall in love, he stopped writing them. His bosom friends at that time predicted that he would pass unscathed from one love affair to another, and they rather envied him his gifts for winning women, good looks, good voice, good figure, and the future they foresaw for him. In fact, some opinion of that kind may have prompted Skeffington's question. I knew they were wrong. Duncan.
Part at least of the attraction Ibsen's dramas had for him may be traced to the secondary role that, quote, the love that piping poets solemnize plays in them. In love, my brother was a realist, and even then in outlook, a married man. Women did not constitute his chief interest in life, nor did he expect to be the main purpose of any woman's life. He knew that sooner or later children would take his place. What makes The Dead such a fine story is the contrast between the lover and the married man, presented not as the eternal triangle, but compassionately. They both loved the woman sincerely as the polar attitudes of the male towards women. He knew as clearly as any rising barrister, doctor, divine, or politician that he must first settle his marriage problem and then get on with the work which he felt himself called upon to do. In spirit, he was still romantic enough or free enough, which may be the same thing, to wish his marriage to be an adventure and a challenge. But when he did settle the question in his fashion, he became a family man. In spite of his struggle with poverty, he believed in fatherhood and considered it a form of cowardice too great a fear of fate not to have children. All right. Do we need to stop and discuss some of the stuff we've been reading?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, let's do so. We started off with William Archer's second letter. Of which I have to say, having read two letters by William Archer, God, don't we all need somebody like that?
Hmm. Hmm.
I'm going back to the last bit we were reading. His
Mhm.
brother Charlie wasn't a Jesuit, was he? Because he said he was training in Clonliffe Road.
Oh, you mean Brother Charlie?
You remember in the last bit we were reading, it was just
Yeah,
because they keep talking about the Jesuits, and his brother Charlie goes off to be a priest,
yeah.
joins the priest. But when they start talking about Clonliffe Road, does that mean that he's one of the there's different types of priests, and the priests that are in the community are not normally Jesuits, the diocesan priests, and wouldn't they be on Clonliffe Road?
So it says yes.
Longleaf Road, yeah, I don't know.
It's just interesting that he talks about Jesuits a lot, and his own brother didn't become one.
Can a person, well, this is a question. I have no idea what the answer is, but can a person who decides to become a priest who has not been schooled in the Jesuit manner become a Jesuit?
Doubt it. Because to become a Jesuit, I think it's a 15-year tenure, whereas for what Orla referred to as diocesan priests would be 7 years.
Hmm.
And the 15-year tenure, part of that can simply be being educated in the Jesuit manner as a
Oh,
student.
absolutely. Yeah. When I say tenure, I mean, I should say training.
Okay. Yeah, that's the impression that I get, only because I mean the Jesuits are, noted for their strictness and lucidity of thought. And I've had friends, various friends who were educated by the Jesuits, as they say, and they've all been um, pretty smart, sharp people.
Yeah.
I think they consider themselves almost independent of the Pope and that, they kind of ran their own kind of. But and they were thrown out of Spain at one time altogether, the Jesuits.
Yeah.
So
Too uppity.
yeah,
I don't think Charles was successful in becoming a priest.
no, I don't think he went on. No, I don't think so.
And am I right in this, Tom? They died within a week of each other.
He died as well.
And,
Yeah, Charlie,
and
yeah.
they both, if you look at the death notice from the Irish Times, they appear under one another on the same day.
Okay, yeah.
But I think he had various careers. So yeah, I think you're right, Orla. I mean, the Clonliffe is
Yeah, I think it's diocesan. Yeah,
it's diocesan. That's where the Archbishop lives, and then all those other Holy Ghost fathers and Jesuits and all, they've got their own communities, and they have a sort of a kind of arm's length relationship to the dioceses. I mean, the crowd I was with at school, they lived in kind of fear of interference by the Archbishop, John Charles McQuaid at the time. So I'd say you're right there for sure.
Not just the students, Joe, but the politicians as well.
Oh yeah, everyone. As we were talking about the religious exams, that's why the Archbishop's exam was important. And we had a guy who wasn't Irish; he was Norwegian, and he wasn't even a Catholic, and he managed to sit the Archbishop's exam. And this guy went around saying he was an atheist, and he said that on the Archbishop's paper. And the head of the school got called up, called across to the palace. What was going on? Using atheists. And it's just a clerical error, literally, that he was let sit the exam.
Mhm.
He was a great friend of mine in school, Eric. Dead dog.
So,
Sorry, go on. I wandered off, or I'm sorry, I wandered off on your
no,
question.
no, that's fine. It's really pertinent. I'm rather curious though about the day of the rabblement,
Yeah.
Hmm.
and basically this was a diatribe against
Mm.
popular Irish theater at the time.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
a paper read in the university. It exists as
Yeah.
a publication.
Mm-hmm. And
I think he thought initially that, the Irish theatre, he went to see Countess Kathleen, even though they were taking signatures against it. But Joyce went to it, Yeats's thing. But he thought that the theatre then would pick up more on the European plays, like Ibsen, of course. But they didn't. They continued on with some more Irish kind of things. And I think that's when he wrote, he got fed up kind of, and I think that's when he wrote The Day of the Rabblement, in response to the continued kind of focus on Irish kind of plays in the Abbey. Yeah.
So I've got Elman on it. Our friend the censor emerges, and they publish it themselves. And they had 85 copies printed for a price of £2.05. That's a huge amount of money in 1901. 85 copies, one of which is in the Museum of Literature Ireland in a glass case. That's where the only place I've seen it. And there's the other one.
Can't see it. It's reflecting too much.
Sorry. It's the little, it just says 2 essays, a forgotten aspect of the university question by F.J.C. Scaffington, and The Day of the Rabblement by James Joyce, price 2p.
85 copies.
Printed by Gerard Brothers of Stephen's Green, Dublin.
Yes, stationery shop across the green from the college. And so if they got 2p for 85, in your head, that's 170 pence, old pennies. And they paid 275 pennies. So they lost a certain amount of pennies on that. Oh, it's gas.
That document I was trying to show you is in the Morgan Library in New York, Lewis. You'll be able to drop in and see it.
It's a very nice looking production. I've only ever seen it behind glass, and it's not open. It's just, you see the cover. It's nicely produced.
It is, yeah.
So I'd love to read it. Can I go back, Duncan, to the letter?
Yes, thank you. That's what I've actually turned. That's where I am right now, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, and the phrase you use, as yet more temperament than anything else in your work, and prefers poetry with a distinct picture. rather than poetry which suggests only a mood.
Yes, and is this not a reference to Marlamay's influence on Joyce, the symbolist?
Yes, I don't know. Could be, obviously.
I believe that that was what the symbolist, their main intention was. Not an argument, not a description, but
Yeah,
to use words in such a way to create a feeling.
yeah. Would you like to hear the only surviving one of those poems? It's 12 lines long. Out of chamber music. It's number 2 in chamber music. I can't remember the title. It's just got a number 2 over it in my edition. Anyway, the twilight turns from amethyst to deep and deeper blue. The lamp fills with a pale green glow the trees of the avenue. The old piano plays an air, sedate and slow and gay. She bends upon the yellow keys, her head inclines this way. Shy thoughts and grave wide eyes and hands that wander as they list. The twilight turns to darker blue with lights of amethyst. That's,
You read that with a certain cynicism, Joe.
Oh no, it's in 8 and 8, and I'm just trying to do it, and get the words pronounced. But the poetry which suggests only a mood, and you can, I get it. The piano plays an air, sedate and slow and gay. She bends upon the yellow keys, her head inclines this way. Yeah, it's a good description of a woman playing piano.
It sounds to me like early Yeats.
Yeah. There's not exactly a plot in it, but if it's catching a mood, it's done it well.
Yeah,
I think. And now that's my 3rd time to read it. I read it to myself a minute ago, and now, so I'm getting used to the words. I'm not sure how to pronounce amethyst.
that's fine.
Twilight turns to darker blue with lights of amethyst. Well, he's written it it's actually not in 8/8, it's in 8 and 6.
Keep going, Joe.
Yeah, but 8 and 6 is I mean, that's what Shakespeare, so that's let's write in 8 and 6. That's the rhythm for mockery in Shakespeare. That's that's for comedy rather than serious.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what's that play it's in? Which play is it? The Midsummer's Night Dream, where Bottom goes, they're putting on the play in the forest, the rehearsal, and Bottom says, "Oh, we'll write an introduction for me." I haven't got the exact words, and write it in 8 and 8, and that would be nice, run right. And then the manager, the director, Shakespeare's in theatre has a director. The director wants it in 8 and 6. And that'll turn it into a comedy. Maybe that's where the cynicism comes from, to deep and deeper blue. That's 6. You cannot make that sound right. He's used the wrong meter, if he's serious.
One of the things that Joyce did with chamber music, he got a specially bound copy of it done in Italy, in Trieste, I presume, as a wedding present for Tom Kettle when he married Mary Sheehy.
Yeah.
Now, whether this was, and he invited them, they went on their honeymoon on the continent, and he invited them to call on him, but they declined. Kettle declined. But there are a few poems in there, related to Mary Sheehy in chamber music, So,
Peter wasn't getting into that.
Yeah.
Oh dear. But that's a great point, Duncan, about the symbolists. I think that's the answer. That's the answer to that letter.
That's what I would. That's what I was feeling. That Joyce, and of course the grandfather of the symbolist is actually Edgar Allan Poe, who influenced Mallarmé and Verlaine.
Yeah.
But I think Poe is given the title of the originator of the symbolist because he was so good at using words to create atmosphere
Right.
and a feeling.
Right.
Yeah. I want to, in addition to the letter, I think this is fantastic, where William Archer or Jim wrote back defending some of his metrical devices, and Archer replied, still patient and controversial. He advised my brother against trying to have his poems published, as someday he might regret it if his talent developed freely and normally. But, and this is where it gets really interesting, but he added with Scotch balance, quote, "It is not always wise to refrain from action in the present because we think we may regret it in the future." So this is a very interesting, to me, rhetorical technique, because it presents both sides and basically leaves the receiver in the position of having to decide which side they want to go with.
Yeah. He's a very skilled publisher.
Yeah, he's good.
He's keeping his, he's keeping his what would you call him, his flock on side.
Yeah, and it's also interesting that at the very end of his letter, he's promoting his latest book.
Yeah, there you go.
Yes.
That's all right.
I wonder if maybe someday I'll try to find, it'd be very interesting to see if there's a book of letters of William Archer.
William Archer,
Because he sounds like a very interesting personality. All right.
68. I'm just wondering about their age difference. No idea.
Well, let's see what they have here.
1924, Archer died. There's a big age difference, I would say, wouldn't there?
Okay.
December 24.
And how old was he when he died?
It doesn't say. I just picked up in a letter. I'm just.
He was 68.
68. So
68.
He was an English spelling reformer, among other things.
You mean a person who was trying to create a regular spelling system in English?
Yeah.
And he's 26 years older than Joyce, then, working that out, which means Joyce is about 20 here, and he's about in his mid-40s. So he's twice twice Joyce's age.
Yep. Well, I think I should point out, although you probably all realize this, that this is an example of Joyce receiving criticism gracefully,
Yeah.
in the sense that, after already receiving a fairly critical letter from William Archer earlier,
Yeah.
he writes again,
Yeah. Yeah.
surely expecting Archer to be just as critical of as he was in the first letter.
He's
So,
credited with writing a long list of critical works.
okay.
But yet only one essay called The Great Analysis, a plea for a rational world order in 1912.
Wow. Yeah, you kind of think that literature is made up of a list of great writers, but there's a whole pyramid of people in the publishing business and reader, the test readers, and there's a whole triangle underneath of which the writer is at the pinnacle, and we never know the names of all those other people who, the bookkeepers who keep the publishing business kind of assembled and all that sort of thing. Sure, ARCH. He argued against James Joyce's Paris plans.
He argued against which now?
Against Joyce's plans to live in Paris.
And who is this? Is this Archer again?
But they meet in London. Then I'm just looking at this index.
Okay, so you're going through. Okay.
Jay meets in London and fails to help with exiles. So that we're up in 1980.
Did the Yeats introduce Joyce to Archer? On Joyce's first trip to Paris.
I think he did.
I think he did, yeah.
It rings a bell. I can't see it.
I think Yeats invited Joyce to maybe stay with him, or while he was traveling on the Lady Gregory wrote to Yeats about Joyce, I think, and asking him to look after him when he hit London. And I think at that time he introduced him to Archer. I might be wrong about that, but yeah.
Well, I think it's really interesting. And I think this is really a good example of James Joyce fairly gracefully accepting criticism from a person who he has respect for. Because I don't think there are too many examples of Joyce gracefully accepting criticism.
Yeah. Good point.
Pleasure.
Oh, bless you.
Thank you.
I think you are very wicked. Not very, said Jem, but I do my best. Okay, seems that we are winding down here, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've just read on ahead in Elman, you know, and by early November 15, Joyce asked William Archer for help. That's with exiles, but Archer was leaving London and would have to read it on his return. A later letter said apropos of portrait that he did not much care for Joyce's form of realism. So this contented relationship doesn't seem to have survived right to the end. So yeah, but at this stage of life, yeah, he is accepting and in a constructive way, and Archer seems to have had that doesn't say he hasn't done his usual balanced comment there in regard to portrait, you know.
So, okay, so Joyce presented Archer with portrait, and then Archer made that comment about he didn't particularly.
He might have read it. He might have read it in the Egoist, or he might have been given a copy or something. But he certainly he didn't respond to the realism. It says there. So, but I mean that's just a point, you know. I just wondered, did it go right to the end? Because Archer would be wonderful because he would have seen Ulysses. You know, he's lived long enough to. So there's no comment on Ulysses and Archer.
Let me confirm. We have basically arrived up. Are we on page 151?
52?
152.
We're on 152.
Yes, at the bottom of the page.
Meanwhile, he was a bachelor undergraduate who loved women and song.
Yes.
Yeah.
But wine, not yet.
Okay, so I don't have a pen on me. I need to take a photo of that. Otherwise. Okay, well, I'm really glad that we met today on Memorial Day.
Yes.
Very much.
Me too.
Worked well. We had a good group, and you know, there's some interesting reading.
This is a lovely read. I'm really getting tons out of this.
Yeah, I'm enjoying it more and more. It's you know, Stanislaus is a very interesting, odd character.
Yeah.
In his mode, you know, what he decides to speak about and how he speaks about it, and his side comments are pretty fascinating. So we will gather again.
You know, I was just going to say Theo van Gogh, Vincent van Gogh's brother, seemed to have a similar role in his life, where, you know, the person who kept it all together, kept the finances going. This has just made me think, I better go look at that, because was this something that happened with artists?
Yeah, and then it just reminded me, Orla, of Patrick Kavanagh's brother. Kind of looked after him all the time as well. You know.
And correct me, but I think in Van Gogh's case, not only his brother, but his brother's wife was extremely instrumental. That his brother, if I'm not mistaken, died a little on the young side, and the wife kind of took over as shepherd and caretaker for Vincent. Yep. Okay.
Yeah, and Yeats too, isn't there? There's a family looking after, you know, the sisters. Maybe that's all artists have it.
Well, you know the way you say you shouldn't become an artist, unless you're well off, like Toulouse-Lautrec or whoever that they
Yeah.
had money behind them so that they could live that sort of lifestyle.
Yeah, a room of your own and an income.
Mhm. Well, I think you have to just be so obsessed that you just have to do it.
Mm.
You know, I think that also is key, and I think that the obsession attracts sometimes it attracts support. You know, Dostoevsky had a terrible hard time.
Mm.
If you ever get a chance and you read of how Dostoevsky kept writing and he kept on getting into more debt through his
Mm.
writing.
And he was gambling as well, wasn't he?
And he did gamble, but they had these real tricky contracts in Russia
Mm.
to where you could write a whole book and get it published and end up in incredible debt to the publisher.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah.
They're very strange debt laws. And it was in Dostoevsky's case, he was lucky to meet the woman who eventually became his wife,
Mm.
and she helped him quite a bit. So
I think Emily
Did she have
Dickinson
an
as
income?
well.
Sorry?
Sorry, Dora, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, did she have an income? So, you know, the way that at that time women didn't work.
Yeah.
So, was she independently wealthy?
I don't remember that. The book that I was reading was really pointing out uh, but the structure of it is showing that in Crime and Punishment, that Crime and Punishment is actually based upon a historical killer in Paris. And Dostoevsky became obsessed with this particular criminal assassin guy. And that's how he started on his book, Crime and Punishment.
Yeah.
I really need to reread it again, as many things I need to reread.
Yeah.
But within that, they're describing the relationship with Dostoevsky's eventually wife.
Mhm.
It just reminded me there of connection today in the sense that early on we were reading about Joyce that he wrote on Blake and William Defoe. Was it William Defoe?
Yeah.
And the writer, is it G.M. Coetzee, has a book out on which he calls Foe, and it's all about power and kind of language, and he brings in the story of Robinson Crusoe. But he also has written a book, The Master of St. Petersburg, which is about Dostoevsky.
So we're talking about Coetzee here? Are we talking about?
Coetzee, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And it's just that it struck me there when you were talking about the two writers. But Coetzee has written in relation to the two of them, kind of novels and some kind of strange novels, yeah.
Okay.
The Master of St. Petersburg.
Okay, thank you for pointing that out. You know, Coetzee did a lot of his graduate work here in Austin, Texas at the university.
Yeah. And he did a lot on Beckett, didn't he? I think. He did
that I don't know, but I'm not surprised.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think he's the only person that he's won the Booker twice, and he has won the Nobel Prize for Literature as well. Yeah, I think I find him a really interesting writer. He left Africa to live in Australia maybe 15, 20 years ago. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Well, it is 3:02, and I'm going to declare that we have done it today. And it's time to for us to thank everybody else and look forward to next Monday, where we will continue our journey with Stanislaus.
Good night.
Great.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Let's see, let me find my button.